So whenever a big story like that was breaking, I always found that my colleagues were incredibly generous with their time and their expertise if it was a story that there's, because we cover such a huge patch. Our patch is basically the entire world. So everyone has to be able to turn their hand to all kinds of different stories really quickly. But equally, whenever a big story like that was breaking, I always found that my colleagues were incredibly generous with their time and their expertise if it was a story that they...
Welcome to How to Be a Journalist, a podcast by News Associates. I'm Plamedi Mbungu, and thank you very much for tuning in. I'm a recent university graduate, and I work at News Associates. I'm early in my career, and I need the wisdom from more experienced journalists. So to solve this problem, in every episode, I will dive into conversations with some of the most dedicated and talented journalists from all corners of our industry, asking questions about their careers, successes, and giving you a different view of the person behind the byline. Whether you're an aspiring journalist, a seasoned figure in the newsroom, or just interested in knowing what happens behind the scenes, you're in the right place. Today's guest is CNN Enterprise writer, Rob Picheta. Rob has spent the past 7 years in a variety of different roles at CNN, starting as intern in 2018, a large spell of time on their international news team, and now he's recently started a new role as part of their US-based enterprise team. His work at CNN has also seen him win 2 Emmy Awards for his role in the breaking news coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in 2022 and the October 7th attacks. But at the end of the day, I can introduce for a long, long time, but the best way to understand Rob is to hear from Rob himself. So how are you doing today, Rob?
I'm doing very well, thanks. Thanks for having me, Plamedi.
No problem at all. So I want to get a little bit of an understanding of what is going on in your career right now. So let's start with your current role as enterprise writer at CNN.
Yeah, it's a great time to ask because I've just a few weeks ago started a really cool new role on CNN's enterprise team. So it's a very small team. It's me and 3 other writers and an editor, and we write and create long-form digital content for CNN's websites. So it's really deep dives, deeply reported stuff, spending a lot of time and putting a lot of resources into each story, which is a really, really great change of pace after 7 pretty exhausting years in the international news cycle.
So with this new role, so it's very much deep dives, long form and feature-based articles that you're writing. So since you've only started a couple of weeks back, is there a first piece in particular that you're putting your time into at the moment?
There's a few. I'm kind of juggling between 2 and 3 different stories, which I wish I could tell you a little bit more about, but I'm going to keep them under my hat. But the process of just spending time on stories that I'm really, really passionate about and just getting really deep into the process is really refreshing, and is the kind of journalism I love to read, and so to be creating it is really great. A lot of them are subscriber stories as well. We've just launched a paywall recently on the US site, and a lot of our stories will go to behind that, trying to attract kind of new audiences and create journalism that's worth paying for. So it's pretty exciting to be on a small team that's kind of one of the driving forces behind a big project for CNN.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit more about the team working element of your role as well. So how are you collaborating with other journalists and other producers to create these long and very detailed and really giving the stories justice? So how does the collaborative effort come in?
Well, most of the work we do is obviously individual for these stories. But we're so lucky as well that there are so many talented people in different roles and in different teams right across CNN. We have great video journalists, visual journalists. We have an OSINT team. We have amazing graphic designers. So when it's appropriate for the story, if I'm working on a story that really has more visual elements that I want to incorporate, I've got very, very talented people that I can work with to make that happen. Others are inevitably more kind of text and photo based. So it depends on the story, but I'm lucky that I have a lot of opportunities to do that kind of work when it makes sense.
There's a good sort of like independence in the role, to be fair. So the stories are of your own choosing as well. You're pitching it and basically seeing it through until, it goes to press. Well, I say that figuratively, of course. So how do you go about like sourcing those stories as well? Because they are all stories that seem to be lesser told ones.
Yeah.
So how do you go about finding them?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of an avid newsreader, as most journalists are, right? And I do read a lot of really great features, and I do think a lot about where those stories and where those people with really interesting, like lesser told stories might be. That is kind of, to me, the most exciting part of the job, is unearthing something that might be a story. If you pull at that thread for long enough, you never really know how it's gonna turn out, and you never really know if you're going to have a story there. But I've never had any problem kind of generating ideas. It used to be earlier in my career that I would almost be generating too many, and I had to kind of train myself to have the discipline to see the process through all the way to the end, because I think when I started as a journalist, I think my favorite story was whatever my next story was, right? And which I think is the case probably for a lot of young, eager journalists. So it's the process of finding those ideas, but also, like you say, giving them the care and attention all the way through the weeks or the months-long process, or however long it takes. It's two different disciplines, two different kind of sides of your brain, and when you get them working together, you can do some really exciting work that you're passionate about.
And what are the different mediums that you are like going about finding these stories? So is it very much social media, or are you just picking up the phone, going old school for the most part, or do you find yourself on the ground? Is it like a mix of all of those factors?
Yeah, all of the above. I mean, social media is a wonderful place to unearth stories. Obviously, with all of the caveats in there about, verifying and being very careful that everything you're unearthing is legit and you can tell it in a responsible way. But social media is a great source of stories. I also just read so much journalism, including kind of more specialist outlets, or, most of the coverage I do is US focused. So I look at a lot of local US sites, which often pick up on something that has a really interesting national appeal and a nationwide element to it, but hasn't yet been found by the other kind of national outlets. So it's a mix of both, and then when you think you have something, I think picking up the phone is really, really important. It's such a crucial part of the journalistic process, is talking to people from the very beginning and all the way through.
Yeah, of course. So since you are very much going to be telling US-based stories, does that mean a relocation is going to be on the cards, or are you going to be reporting from London?
I'm reporting from London at the moment. I'd love to relocate. I think the US is such a beautiful and interesting country, and everyone is very welcoming, but everyone really has a story to tell, which kind of attracts me as a journalist. I've visited a bunch of times as a tourist because I love visiting, and I would love to. Yeah, it's been a personal and a professional ambition of mine to get out there. We'll see. It's not my decision ultimately, but if I have something to contribute, it's a move I'd love to make. Yeah.
Yeah. CNN are very much an American broadcaster.
Yeah.
And you've worked for them for the past 7 years or so. How does the way that news is reported on differ in the States in comparison to the UK? A bit of a long-winded way to ask it, but yeah.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I, until recently, worked for the international arm of CNN, so I was involved in telling global stories for a US audience and also an international audience from the London bureau. And, the main difference in that position compared to if I were working for a UK outlet, I think really is in looking for the big picture in every story and not getting caught in the weeds in any topic. So I spent a lot of time covering UK politics, for example, and I was involved in kind of guiding some of our UK politics for a couple of years. But CNN readers are not interested in every single twist and turn that comes out of Westminster, right? You have to really pick your moments. And when you do cover the UK, you have to do it in a way that is accessible to everyone and hints to something of wider significance, something that interests readers all around the world and maybe nods to a trend that's Europe-wide or a trend or a link with the US. So you pick your moments and you try to tell the story in the broadest possible terms. That doesn't mean you can't kind of be forensic and detailed in your reporting, but in terms of how you frame a story and the stories that you choose to cover, you have to be kind of having that bigger picture mindset. Whereas if I was, reporting for the Telegraph or the Guardian, it would be they're covering every single twist and development in relation to any kind of policy, and they'll be covering dozens of different political stories in a week. So I think the biggest difference was in mindset, really, more than anything else. Is this interesting to everyone? Does this speak to a kind of broader issue, or would we be kind of getting caught in the weeds if we covered this?
Of course. I asked that question because on a previous episode that I had with Reporters Without Borders UK director Fiona O'Brien, and she advised me and basically very much told me that if you ever want to hear a good British story, let's say, for example, there's a big story in British politics that everybody's following, the best place to get the news is from Agence France Presse, for example, or a CNN, for example. See what the international newspapers are saying about the British story, because they tend to be a little bit less close to it. So they are able to report with a little bit more objectivity, but I guess it depends on who you're asking. But do you agree with that sentence?
Sure, I think that's a really good observation. I think I agree with that. I think having a little bit of distance as a journalist can really be an asset, because it allows you to kind of pick out something that you really do think needs telling without necessarily being caught in the weeds of the kind of partisan, push and pull. So now in relation to my current role as well, it's a mindset I try to carry over, because I grew up in Britain. I'm based in London, covering the US, and I think having just that slight bit of distance alongside a real interest in what's going on in the US news cycle is an asset, is a benefit, because I just want to tell a story that I think is important in the most objective, responsible way possible. And I think I can maybe kind of pluck out that story and cover that story without getting sucked into the kind of, more polarized political environment, which I think is what readers want at the end of the day. So that's a kind of inverted example of that. But I do think that's a great point. I think distance can really benefit journalism and benefit readers.
Yeah, of course. So, and how do you go about building your contacts and your network with journalists and people out in the US to, help you create those stories that you're telling?
Yeah, there's obviously some challenges that come with that kind of network building with when you're slightly removed from the area you're covering. But I think, it's my advice to anyone starting out would be to be very targeted in who they're reaching out to, and doing their research and really having an idea of how this person can help me tell this story, why it's important that I kind of talk to this person, what I'm hoping to get out of this conversation. So I think those questions probably guide me when I'm trying to build up a network of sources.
Okay. So I think that works out as a nice segue into talking about your previous writing. Sure. And then your time with the international team. So you spent 7 years on that team. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I spent 7 years as a reporter on the international team. Just about everything that you can imagine happening in the news cycle happened in those 7 years, which was really thrilling and exciting as a journalist. Exhausting sometimes as well, but that's okay. That's part of the gig. So I was involved in covering the invasion of Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, a kind of really whirlwind period in European politics. And then towards the end of my time, my last couple of years there, I kind of carved out this UK niche and guided some of that UK coverage, the election last year, and a bunch of other political coverage. It was an incredibly exciting first few years in journalism. I'm very grateful that I did get to start both at a really great company, but also at a time when there was so much to sink your teeth into. So I probably started out as more of a generalist and then started to specialize over the course of my time there, which is often the way that it goes. So that was a really good mix of different kinds of stories. I got out to do a lot of great on-the-ground reporting around Europe and around Britain, which was really exciting. I had a great time.
The variety of different stories that you worked on during that time seemed, you got it's not the journalist dream, to be fair, because you risk being, a little bit immature to just say it's the journalist dream, for example, covering these important stories. But you had such a range. So general elections, the war in Russia, the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East as well, all these different things, going to Clacton, all these different places. I thought, well, okay, I have to start with one and then make my way with the rest. So let's start with the invasion of Ukraine. So that was coverage that essentially got you nominated. You won an Emmy for that. Yeah. So tell me about
alongside, as a member of such an unbelievably talented team, because ultimately journalism is a team sport, and that Emmy was a kind of unexpected but very lovely testament to the work that I did with all of my colleagues in London. It was a totally frantic time. I will never forget the morning that I woke up and saw that invasion was underway, and just realized that, I suppose, a whole new chapter of my career and my profession was starting, right? This is going to be my life for a long period of time. So it was exhausting coverage, but we did a really wonderful job. I think our coverage of that invasion and then the weeks following was really incisive and responsible, and I look back on that time. I don't know if I'd like to repeat it. It was exhausting, but I'm proud of the work that we all did on that story.
How did the shift patterns look like because I guess the breaking news sort of environment when such a monumental event happens, how was that?
Yeah, it's a little bit all hands on deck, and everyone was kind of chipping in with weekends and late shifts from what I can remember, just to kind of keep our coverage going. But that's the gig. That's why you get into news, right? And as a journalist, I think you want to be telling those stories, and you want to be reporting on huge moments in history. So I think everyone was very eager to chip in whatever way they could.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the collaborative team effort?
Yeah.
Because it seems like even in your Twitter posts, basically marking your end of your time with the international news team, you spoke on quite a few of your colleagues that essentially helped you throughout that entire process. So could you speak some more about that?
Oh my God, yeah. Happily, I think the world of all of my colleagues on that team and every, the great thing about that team is that everyone kind of has to at least start as a bit of a generalist, because we cover such a huge patch. Our patch is basically the entire world. So everyone has to be able to turn their hand to all kinds of different stories really quickly, but equally everyone had specialities and specialisms and beats that they really owned really well. So whenever a big story like that was breaking, I always found that my colleagues were incredibly generous with their time and their expertise if it was a story that they had been deep in the coverage of for many years, because the way that it goes is that year was the year where Ukraine was the prevailing global story. The next year it was the Middle East. The news cycle is obviously unpredictable. That's why we love it, but that's also why it's great to have colleagues who can really help guide coverage if it falls in an area that they're really knowledgeable in. And there's a really great culture on that team, and there was a culture of people asking questions and people taking the time to show new reporters and new members of the team the ropes. And I think building that kind of culture is so important when a big story like that happens, because then everyone's bought in and everyone really wants to make sure the coverage is as good as possible.
If you could summarize into one sentence your experience covering Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that breaking out back in 2022,
yes,
how would you go about doing exactly that?
I suppose you asked for a sentence, right? Not a word. Okay, sentence. Phew, because
that'll be coming later on.
Sure. Oh God. Okay. I think I would say I think everyone understood from the beginning the importance of telling that story responsibly and getting the framing absolutely right. And I think that guided our coverage really from that first day in terms of, what can we say and what does this mean, all the way through and including right up until today. I think everyone kind of understood the stakes and the importance of covering that story properly and responsibly.
Yeah. And I'm going to circle back to what you just said about framing as well. So for anybody that doesn't know about framing, could you explain why framing in media is so important?
Yeah, how you frame a story, so how you decide to package the headline, the lead, and just more broadly the angle that you decide to take on a certain story is incredibly important because and this goes doubly in digital journalism, which is really where my whole career has been kind of grounded, because no matter how much amazing reporting you do and how much time you and care and attention you put into a story, if you don't get the framing right, people aren't going to read it, people aren't going to engage in it. And so you're doing your own work a disservice, as well as the kind of the stories of the people that you're trying to tell, if you don't think really carefully from the beginning, I find, about how best to frame a story. I think a mistake that a lot of journalists early in their career make is that they leave that kind of stuff to the very end and they overlook it. And I think giving yourself the clear guide and the vision at the beginning of saying, this is the story I want to tell and this is how I think I want to frame it, really helps guide your reporting and keeps it focused and keeps the story tight and accessible, and then make sure that people actually do engage with it.
Yeah, of course. And so you also you and your team won an Emmy Award as well for your coverage of the October 7th attacks as well. So talk to me about that process as well and how it differed from the invasion of Ukraine.
Again, yeah, I mean, another example of one of these once-in-a-generation kind of global stories breaking, except that we had 2 in 2 years. The day that happened, I was actually in Poland on a different assignment. I was doing some reporting ahead of the Polish elections. So I woke up very early and again had that moment of wow, okay, the world is kind of changing and our coverage really needs to meet that moment. I ended up finishing my assignment in Poland and then flew back to London and kind of immediately started chipping in on the coverage of the October 7 attacks and the war in Gaza, and which kind of stretched well into the next year. I think in terms of how it differed, we as a team almost had the muscle memory of responding to that invasion of Ukraine, which I actually do think helped kind of guide our coverage and response in those first hours. And then again, that story called for really responsible reporting that is framed and angled in an appropriate way, perhaps even more so than the previous story. So again, that had to be at the front of our minds in everything we wrote, if it live blogs, lead stories, analysis stories, explainers, all of it had to be responsible. So a lot of the process, a lot of the actual workflow was the same. Obviously, the subject matter was completely different, and again, we're lucky that we have great journalists at CNN who had been covering the build-up of that story for years and years, who were invaluable. But again, a lot of the workflow and a lot of the big questions that we're asking ourselves and the kind of the focus of making sure that we frame a story responsibly, that was the same from one to the next.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And then final international news question I have. So you very much took a lead on British politics for a little period of time as well, especially around the general election, as you alluded to earlier. So tell me about that experience too, of being focused on stories on our shores over here.
Yeah, I loved the election. That was a really memorable highlight from my career to sort of guide our coverage of that election last year, both in terms of I went out on a couple of assignments to do sort of features leading into the election, but also I sort of led a lot of the planning for our digital coverage of that election on the night. And then so a lot of time and energy went into kind of planning it to make sure our coverage was spot on. And then, of course, the night itself, whizzes by in 5 minutes. But covering the UK was a real thrill and gave me a great opportunity to take on a sort of leadership role on that particular beat in the company, which was a great opportunity. I've also I was in the lobby, which is the kind of parliamentary press gallery, the press pack of reporters that goes into Parliament to report on what's going on in Westminster. So I tried to cover Britain, not just in the build-up to the election, but in the year since as well, from, again, that kind of step back, big picture mindset. It's easy, I think, to get sucked into, especially when you're in Westminster doing reporting from Parliament, to get sucked into the kind of who's up, who's down on any given day. And it's really important for any journalist to keep their audience in mind. I knew that our audience didn't necessarily need to know about all of that, but they needed to know about the major and important trends and conversations that are happening in this country. So it was a great 2 years covering the UK, and I think the election campaign was probably the highlight. I got to, as you mentioned, I went to Clacton to do a story, I went up to Stoke to do a story as well. Those 6 weeks flew by. But it was a really exciting time to be kind of helming and guiding a big priority story for the network through all of those 6 weeks and then through the night as well.
Your piece on Clacton in particular, that I gave it a really fascinating
Thank
piece.
you.
And one thing that, alongside the journalism, I knew that the writing was going to be of a good quality and it's going to be well sourced, very much multi-sourced. But something that surprised me about how good you were able to do was the photojournalism as well.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, did you learn that, or was it just very much just off the cuff?
That's really kind of been a hobby, but I've always been interested in photography and I've enjoyed it. You know, we have wonderful professional photojournalists obviously at CNN, but and when they go out on assignment to do a photo-led story, that those, I'd encourage anyone to look up a couple, because those are really, really excellent. I'm nowhere near that level, but there are opportunities now and again to when I'm out on a story and there's no photographer assigned, but I know that there'll be visual elements. I really love the chance to take my camera out and get some photos. And I think it worked for that one as well, because Clacton really was kind of a unique place. It didn't feel like anywhere else in the UK, which was obviously interesting editorially, given its significance in the election. But I really kind of felt that I wanted to get some of that across visually as well. So I did think quite a lot about how to present those photos in the piece.
What was the most fascinating story or conversation that you had when you were out there?
On that story?
Yeah.
Oh, I found that people were really introspective and willing to I was most interested in the people who had lived for a very long time or even their whole lives, because they spoke really interestingly about how the place has changed over 5-6 decades that they'd been alive. And those are the stories that I'm fascinated in. I mean, like, election campaigns are really exciting because they give any political journalist a chance to get out and about across the country. But I think if anyone ever gets the chance to do that, I would really insist that to get out by yourself, and rather than following a choreographed photo op, and really tell the story of the place that you're in. And I was interested in everyone's insights in Clacton. I really enjoyed my time there. Everyone was very welcoming, and very willing to chat, and everyone had a very interesting story, but they all were disappointed about the way that their town had kind of been treated by successive governments, and everyone seemed to remember a better time in the town. And I found that was a really interesting trend to pluck out.
Yeah. Okay. Very, very nice. So now I want to segue into a game.
Okay.
So essentially, I am going to give you a story that is prevalent in the news right now. And I'd like to see how you would do a deep dive or a feature or an article on the topic. So it's going to be quite general. And
Is this a job interview? Is that what's happening right now?
You know what? To be fair, we can make that happen. So, let's say, okay, Zoran Mandani is the Democratic nominee for Mayor of New York. How would you do a deep dive on that story?
That's a great question. He's a really interesting character and would be fascinating for a profile. I love writing profiles and reading them as well. And it's a little bit of a lost art. I think it's becoming less prevalent. But my favorite kinds of pieces are ones that maybe center an interview with the subject, but then also do some really deep reporting around them, talk to people who have known them at different phases in their life, and try to build that picture of, who is this person, what drives this person. And I think he'd be a brilliant subject for that kind of story. So I think that's where my mind goes, is that I would love to profile the effect he's had on New York, but also kind of get a better understanding of who is this person, what drives him.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. I think he's definitely one of the most interesting figures that we've seen in politics, especially, and it definitely seems like a ripple effect will most definitely come from that. So yeah, okay, so now it's time to take it back. So when was that first moment that you decided that you wanted to become a journalist?
Oh, for me, it was actually quite late in the day. I studied history as an undergrad at Warwick, and it wasn't until my final year there where I really decided that journalism was the course I want to do. And once I did decide it kind of seemed really obvious, and I didn't quite understand why it took me so long to get there because I loved reading journalism. I was very interested in politics and in the world around me. And I loved writing. I mean, that was the skill that I really had from a young age that I really was very confident in my abilities in. So I ultimately decided to put those two together and become a journalist. But, journalism is not a career that you are guided towards at any point. You have to kind of seek it out. So I think it's a common story that I hear a lot from my friends and my colleagues in the industry was that it's never inevitable that someone becomes a journalist, right? It's a much more niche skill that people have to really want to do. So I guess that would be why it took me a long time, right up until my final year of my undergrad, to have that sort of epiphany.
And were there any specific skills that you learned on your undergrad that has, well, surprisingly prepared you for your career in journalism?
I think so. I mean, I think the kind of process of reporting and writing, even though I wouldn't necessarily have called it reporting on my undergrad, but the research process and the thought process of here's what I've researched, here's what I found. Now, how am I going to kind of present that information in a readable and compelling way? I think all of that bled into my career probably in ways that I maybe take for granted, but I think there's definitely a through line, and I can see why, you and I were chatting before we started recording about how many history students go into journalism, and I think you can probably trace the through line.
History and politics and geography or languages, the BAs that I've seen crop up
Yeah.
quite frequently and on the podcast, I actually reckon after a little while I'm going to do a little bit of a tally.
You should. I'd be interested in that.
Oh no, most definitely. I will get around to that. The amount of Warwick alumni or alumni that have come on, number one. I know we've had a couple of Loughboroughs as well.
Okay.
So they're second place or so, but it's always interesting. It's always interesting to see the different pipelines also.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have gone into journalism after making that change. So then, before we start your Fast and Furious round, were there any jobs that you did outside of journalism that have unexpectedly prepared you for your career?
Oh, I love that question. So you're talking very early jobs that have absolutely nothing to do with the industry.
Absolutely nothing.
So I waited tables in a restaurant in Chiswick while I was at uni on my undergrad. Did it help me in journalism? I mean, look, not in any obvious ways, but I suppose the process of talking to people and dealing with people is quite an important part of the job. And I think anyone who does any role that's public facing probably gets used quite quickly to talking to people and sometimes bearing the brunt of their anger or frustration at an order that you've gotten wrong. So look, every experience is helpful, right? And I think possibly that might have helped.
I guess at the end of the day, it's communication skills. Yeah. It really comes across. Like I definitely will, I will give my experience in drama and in music, a little bit of like a high five for putting me in the position where I am right now, because I don't think I'd be able to if I didn't have those experiences, and I didn't even know it at the time.
Totally. Drama, I studied drama until A-level, and I think that probably really helped me. I think it's so important to, if you want to be a journalist, to just get used to talking to people, maybe not performing necessarily, but going up in front of a lot of people or interrupting someone's day to ask them a few questions, all of those skills that no one loves to do, but they're incredibly essential.
Do you remember the first time you did the Vox Pop?
God, it would have been at City. I think quite early on they sent us out to Chapel Market in Islington to do some Vox Pops. I do remember that assignment. I don't think I enjoyed it very much, but I look back now and I think it was a pretty important process to learn.
It's just a rite of fire that you have to go through, and then
Absolutely.
After a while, it becomes like just a normal part of the day.
Second nature. Yeah.
Second nature, of course. And I will have, before the Fast and Furious round, I genuinely was going to go straight to it, but then I do want to ask a work-life balance question for you as well. So how do you go about promoting it? Because I actually do think it's quite an important thing, because from the outside looking in, journalism does seem like a bit of an all-consuming sort of industry to work in. So how do you go about promoting a healthy work-life balance?
That's such a great question. And I think newsrooms are getting better at recognizing that people do need to switch off when they're not working, and spotting burnout and trying to prevent it. You have to find something, I would say, that does enable you to totally switch off. Now, for me, that's easier said than done, because I don't relax well and I am a bit of a workaholic. And if I leave it unchecked, I do just keep checking my emails and having thoughts well into the evening, and I endlessly opening my laptop after I've thought I've closed it for the last time in the day. But when that's happening, I do try and force myself away. I love to run. I mean, for me, going on a long run is the one time that I can completely switch off to the world around me, and I feel incredibly refreshed after doing it. So whatever that is for anyone, you have to be able to find it. As a young reporter, it is kind of harder and more daunting to put your hand up and say, I actually can't take a ninth consecutive shift in a row, for example. I actually need a day to switch my brain off so that I can come back the day after and do a better job. But it's essential for reporters of every age, and I, my advice would be for everyone to find something that they can do without thinking about work at all.
Yeah, no, most definitely. I think trying to, promote the healthy work-life balance and trying to actually and properly switch off is quite difficult as well, especially when you're working in social media, if you're working in journalism for the most part, because the news is always going to be there. Yeah. Even when you are trying to unwind and you're scrolling through Instagram just to see pictures of your friends, you're very likely going to see on some of these stories something that's going on in the news, and you immediately go, oh, okay, I'm actually quite interested in what's going on there. And then you are already just putting yourself into the mode. So.
And the stories that we cover are often incredibly difficult stories. And I do think every reporter needs to be aware of that. If you're covering a war or a conflict, or it really does take a toll, and it's okay to recognize that it takes a toll, and find ways to de-stress. Otherwise, you get sucked into a story and you do burn out. Burnout happens in journalism a lot, and it's so important to prevent it.
No, of course. Okay. So now we have a bit of an understanding of your career and why it's got to the heights that it has. And I'm assuming this upwards trajectory is not stopping anytime soon. Not anytime soon. But I like to call this next round the Fast and Furious round, where I ask questions to understand the man behind the byline. And the first one is, are you an extrovert or are you an introvert?
I think I'm an introvert, but I also think that I can, if I'm in a situation with people who I'm comfortable in, or if I'm on the job, I find that I can switch quite easily and quite quickly. Deep down, I would consider myself an introvert, but journalism often is an extrovert's job. So I think I found a fine line where I'm able to flip between the two.
Because out of the interviewees that I've had on this podcast so far, introvert has been the overwhelmingly.
Has it really?
Yeah, there's been more. And there's a lot of people working in broadcast, working in radio. And yeah, introverts. We've had maybe 2 extroverts at this point. Night owl or an early riser?
I'm probably a night owl. Like I say, my brain is kind of constantly whirring into the evening, and I find that actually I'm really productive in the evenings. Often, if I open my laptop after dinner and do a couple of hours work, which I'm not recommending people follow as a healthy pattern, but I find that I often do quite good work. Yeah, later in the day, I'm definitely a night owl.
Who would be your dream interviewee if you haven't interviewed them already?
That's a good question. And I hope it's not too much of a cop-out to say that my answer really does change a lot. I think when I was on the UK politics beat, I obviously you always want to interview whoever is the prime minister at any moment. I did interview Liz Truss after she left office, and I was very excited about that interview because I felt that there was a lot to get into there. And but in my current role, and to be honest, the interviews I really love doing are ones that are revealing about interesting people with stories to tell who are not actually necessarily that well known. I'll give you a really niche answer.
Go on.
I don't think anyone will have given you this answer on a previous episode. But there's a town in the middle of Nebraska, a tiny town that's about 4 miles from any city. And for the last 20 years, there's been one resident in that town, this woman in her 80s, who's the mayor, and she runs the library, and she runs the bar, and she runs the kind of, she's kind of the one-woman police force. I just think that is such a fascinating, unique story, and I would love to go there and spend time with her and listen to her speak about that experience of being the sole survivor of a town in a world where the shifts towards urbanization and technology and kind of leaving places like this behind a little bit. What is it like to be the kind of one resilient survivor who still loves your town and still keeps it running? A story like that just draws me in so much because I just think there's so much to get into. So those are the kinds of interviews at the moment that I really obsess about.
You know what? Fair play.
No one's told you that?
No one's told me that. That's actually going to be extremely difficult for anybody to beat. That's probably my favorite answer to that question yet. Okay. So then if you were going to interview her after this podcast recording.
Okay.
So you are going to go take a flight out to Nebraska and you're interviewing her. What song would you play or podcast would you listen to essentially psych yourself up for the interview?
Oh, look, I mean, when I have an interview coming up, I really try to do as much research as I can, which first of all is the boring part of the answer. So I kind of obsess over every single detail, and I try to have a question and then a follow-up and anticipate everything that someone might say. But I do actually think it's a great question because it's great to kind of switch your brain off for 5 minutes before you go into a situation like that. What song or what podcast? I mean, I listen to different songs by the week, but I suppose Chapel Roan's never let me down in a situation like that.
Yeah, no, of course.
But I'll throw on some pop or some rap or something that just completely kind of can take your mind off a situation for 5 minutes.
Biggest myth about the journalism industry that you'd like to dispel?
That's a good question. I suppose there's a myth that editors want to tear people down, which in my experience has never been true. I think there's this kind of image, which maybe is a holdover from kind of Fleet Street days of a few decades ago, where every newsroom was obsessing about how to expose someone or if there was a popular public figure, how to tear down their reputation. I've never found that to be the case, personally, in my experience in the industry. I think people want to sort of get to know public figures more, especially nowadays. I think that's what readers want, and I think that's what journalists want to do, is kind of shed light on things, on people and on groups, and obviously reveal injustices and shine a light on practices that need to be brought to light. But it's never with a mindset of, I don't think journalism is a particularly negative. I don't think negative stories or the kind of lust for negative stories is what drives most journalists. Personally, I think that's a myth that probably an image that probably a lot of people have with the industry, which in my experience hasn't been the case.
Yeah. And what TV show are you currently watching at the moment?
I just finished Day of the Jackal which is a really good thriller, which I don't want to spoil too much of, but I'd recommend that. That was good. What else? Oh, I'm obsessed with The Traitors, and so I've watched pretty much every English language version there is, and at some point I'm going to have to start watching the non-English language ones with subtitles on because I'm going to run out. So I just finished a series of the New Zealand edition of that show, and it was great.
No, I can imagine. Would you go on?
I'd love to go on The Traitors. Yes. If there's anything I would put aside a career in journalism for, I think that might be it.
I think you'd be pretty good on it. I'm just getting, from general vibe I'm feeling.
Is that a compliment?
And final question is, one word to describe your career as of right now.
One word. I mean, I think the thing that really I've focused the idea I focused my career on is being a very kind of digitally minded journalist, because I really felt, just going back to kind of, getting into the industry, I found when I was doing my master's at City, which gave me such a great grounding in reporting skills, but I kind of got the sense that I was entering the industry at a bit of a crossroads where we were learning a lot about print journalism, and there was a kind of almost romanticism from a lot of our teachers about print journalism. But I would look around my lecture hall and think, like, no one here has bought a newspaper in the past month. It's not how we're consuming journalism. And I kind of recognized very early on that I saw an opening in the industry to make myself a kind of an expert and authority in digital journalism and in blending the kind of traditional reporting skills with the kind of journalism that meets audiences where they are and follows them into new places. So I think putting those two together is probably what's kind of defined my career. So, I would say, digitally minded. That's two words, but are you going to allow that?
I can allow it. The hyphen will do its job, I guess.
True. We love a hyphen.
We do. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Like, I've very much enjoyed the conversation, and I feel like everybody listening in today will have an understanding about you as the person, but you as the journalist as well. And if they are looking to work at a place like CNN or reporting on foreign affairs or even affairs in the UK, they'll have a lot of the tools to do exactly that.
I hope so. Yeah, I've enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
No problem at all. I've been Plamedi Mbungu, and this is How to Be a Journalist.